of Labor and Employment Relations at the University of Illinois. Bob is my boss, and so I will say all sorts of nice things about him. He also directs the university's Labor Policy Analysis Unit, the project for Middle Class Renewal. A lot of you on the call are familiar with. And we are going to be presenting later, Frank Manzo's later going to be presenting some of the research, hot off the presses research. Y'all will be the first people to see this research that on the gig economy in Chicago. Bob has taught numerous labor studies and labor relations courses. He is not just the director of the program, but a very active educator all throughout the state of Illinois. He's the author of 4 books, most recently, A Fight for the Soul of Public Education, the Chicago Teacher Strike, which right now seems like a very timely piece of writing. And he is frequently recognized as an expert by national local media on work, the workplace, labor unions, and employment and labor policy. Bob.
Hey, well, I think it's a good rule when someone introduces you in such a pleasant way to probably say as few words as possible, so as not to change the opinion of the listeners. So Steph, thanks. That was very kind. I just wanted to take a minute as the director of the Labor Education Program and the Project for Middle Class Renewal, and a colleague of a number of people who are joining us this evening. I want to express my gratitude to all of you for spending a little bit of time with us this evening on a subject matter, what we refer to as the gig economy, particularly with a focus on rideshare drivers this evening. As we focus on this as a key transformational development in our labor markets, in how we think about work, who a worker is, and what the policy and legal implications of that for the individual worker, but more broadly for the communities that we live in. A number of years ago, our program inaugurated something that we called Communities Under Attack, in which we wanted to focus on important policy issues impacting work and to demonstrate how the changes in these particular labor markets would have impacts on neighborhoods, how they'd have impacts on the cities and villages and towns we live in. And from our perspective, many of the changes which were reducing, weakening, gutting labor protections were really attacks on the community. Sometimes they were on particular communities, or there were disproportionate impacts on those communities. But we inaugurated this a number of years ago, and we focused on right to work efforts that were initiated in Illinois and in fact had spread through the Midwest. And we took this topic and we created half-day programs that we went on the road with, and we traveled around the state, and we got enormous attendance from the community, organized labor, workers who were not part of labor unions, people of different professional backgrounds turned out for these programs. Well, now we're in this COVID period when we can't physically congregate. So we've taken the step to go virtual, and this is the second rendering of Communities Under Attack. So we hope you'll find this educational. We hope you'll find it informative. And I should note for you, it is the second in a series of activities that we will be doing in December. We held a Sunday Facebook Live event, and this is part of something we do on a regular basis now, every month. And we focused on rideshare and gig work, and we will be following this with additional work. So again, welcome. It's great to have you here. I hope that you enjoy this, and we'll learn something from the activity. I know I'm going to listen, and I'm going to learn a great deal. So Steph, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob, so much. And I want to mention, if you want to learn more about all of our speakers, you should have received via email a packet of information that has our speaker bios, their full bios. It also has um, the research report that we're going to be studying here. It has one of the PowerPoints we're going to be seeing, and more information. Probably, if you were on the call earlier, it's I think 68 pages. So don't worry, we're not going to read all 68 pages in this, but it's meant to be a resource guide that you could take home and have with you after this program is over, and maybe even share with some other folks. Next up, I want to introduce my colleague and a good friend of mine, Dr. August Wood. Augustus is a scholar of political economy and gentrification, social movements, and working class labor in the late 20th and early 21st century African American urban history. He's currently a postdoctoral research associate with us here at the Labor Education Program at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Wood has authored articles that appear in the Labor Studies Journal and has co-authored book chapters with Dr. Sundiata Chijua, another professor here at the university. He is a contributor on Routledge's forthcoming Encyclopedia of Anti-Racism, which is going to be great. And he is also a member of the editorial board at the Humanities and Social Sciences Journal. And he is the host of the radio free labor program on 90.1 WEFT Champaign Radio here in Champaign. So Gus, if you could begin your part.
And Stephanie, want to mention that she's also the co-host alongside me on Radio Free Labor too. So thank you, Stephanie. And thank you all for joining us today in such an important topic. I think it is more than appropriate to classify Proposition 22 and the gig economy model as the most damaging anti-worker legislation platform since Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. And it couldn't have come at a more worse time for the working classes, but at a better time for the corporations. Currently, weekly unemployment claims are higher than the highest levels during the Great Recession. These jobs lost at this point are gradually being replaced by temporary, unstable, low wage, no benefit, non-union labor in sectors like the temporary staffing agencies and gig labor. The share of unemployed workers unable to pay their bills on time doubled to 22% between August and October of 2020, while those same workers who spent more than their household income, that number jumped from 19 to 29% in the exact same time frame. Lastly, over 50% of the unemployed lack short-term and long-term savings. Consequently, more people today are facing deepened generational poverty, food insecurity, and housing insecurity, more so than almost the last 100 years. Officials may not label it a second Great Depression, yet from the top, because they're from the top looking down, but from the bottom up, there is no other way to describe the current material and social conditions other than a second Great Depression. So thus we have this huge reserve army of labor, those unemployed who are seeking any type of labor to earn income, particularly in the Black and brown working classes, who are being targeted by these growing gig companies who are preaching freedom to work, independence. You can do whatever you want to do. One former educator lost his job during the start of the pandemic and said after applying for over 200 jobs, receiving not one interview, that nothing is there but gig work. Another worker looking for a full-time job for months who made hundreds of phone calls with no prospects stated, quote, "I just feel defeated," end quote. He had to move back in with his parents, who only qualified for $68 a week in unemployment benefits themselves. And he had to ignore his worsening debt while he used the DoorDash pay simply to put food on the table and pay for the electricity. Both middle class and working class people face an uncertain and disillusioned future where there is little option for legal income other than gig labor. Temporary workers in gig jobs are shackled to the clock, working more and more hours on erratic and unstable schedules, simply trying to make ends meet. Consequently, these overwhelming working rhythms that have devastated the working classes for decades have come to a head in recent months. And as they diminish the capacity for people to participate in social institutions, organizing social movements against injustice, or enjoy rest and relaxation with their loved ones. So time is literally of the essence. Gig companies flaunt that their workers have this freedom to work whenever they want, which is absolutely false, as we'll talk more about on the program today. DoorDash and Grubhub drivers can't work when people don't want food, and they have to work when people want food that costs a lot of money, so they'll get the largest tips to pay for the rising cost of living. One woman who couldn't find work elsewhere this year drove for Uber Eats from 9 p.m. to 1 a.m. with her 6-year-old daughter in the back seat, delivering meals because those were the times where she could make the best pay to offset her bills. Additionally, the results of Prop 22, as we'll learn more about later, are already further damaging workers in California and possibly soon the rest of the nation. Instead of paying for the benefits and protections that labor law mandates, companies like Uber, Lyft, and Postmates and Instacart are only required to offer limited benefits and a wage that works out to $5.64 an hour rather than the $13 an hour they would receive as employees under the California state minimum wage law. Gig companies introduce additional customer fees to cover these so-called benefits for workers, despite suggesting in the campaign that prices will only go up if they didn't get their way. Grubhub drivers are now worse off because tipping is now optional. Also, Albertsons Companies, which runs a number of grocery chains across the United States, laid off their unionized delivery drivers in California so they could take advantage of gig labor. And this is only the beginning of a long-term plan to implement the gig model, complete with sub-working class wages and no benefits across our entire working class political economy. So this is a serious, serious issue. If we do not fight back in an organized manner, the gig industry seeks to be the vanguard in transforming our labor status to independent contractor, mirroring the majority of Google's current workforce. The stakes of this conversation are as such. Gig, app, and temp workers are workers and should be recognized as such with collective bargaining rights and benefits that come with being workers. Today's platform begins a series of events where we analyze the emerging problem of the gig economy model of worker exploitation so that we, both workers and scholars together, united, build a proactive, strong solution to seize those very rights that all workers deserve. Outside the US, Uber and other gig companies continue to lose legal battles to their exploitative practices, largely because of a 2019 wildcat strike of Brazilian, Mexican, British, Canadian, and Italian workers. High courts in those countries have ruled that Uber drivers are employees or open lawsuits to reclassify them as such. So you know that the fight is on across the world as these drivers and other workers come together to fight these companies. Now it's our turn in the states to escalate the grassroots strikes and work actions by gig workers and organize our resistance to the gig economy model. On the ground already, you have gig drivers filing lawsuits to rule Prop 22 unconstitutional. You have Google workers and other white collar workers who are sympathetic to these blue collar issues, who have been sending resources and funding to drivers organizing against these legislations. That's why the studies, data, context, and analysis we have for you today are central to this organizing. Thus, our wonderful list of speakers today are ready to present as to why we must call to action now. So again, thank you all for joining us tonight, and I'll turn it back over to Stephanie to get us started.
Thank you, Gus. I appreciate that. And we wanted to start with giving some broad context. Next up, we have Terry Gerstein, who is the director of the State and Local Enforcement Project at Harvard Law School Labor and Work-Life Program and a senior fellow at the Economic Policy Institute. I've really enjoyed getting to know through email Terry over the last couple of weeks as we've been planning this event. She was recently an Open Society Foundation's Leadership and Government Fellow. Previously, she was the Labor Bureau Chief in the New York State Attorney General's Office and a Deputy Commissioner commissioner in the New York State Department of Labor. So if you're catching a theme here, Terry has been fighting for workers on the side of workers' rights in a lot of different forums. Before government service, she was a nonprofit lawyer in Miami and Florida, and this is one of my favorites, where she represented immigrant workers and co-hosted a Spanish language radio show on workers' rights. We basically only let people on today who have their own radio shows or used to have their own radio shows. Her writing on workers' rights issues has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC's Newsthink, Slate, CNN Business, and the American Prospect, among others. In a very real way, Terry is helping to shape the national dialogue on this issue. She's a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, and Terry has a presentation for us, and I should mention her presentation is available in the packet that we sent you. So you do not need to be like taking screenshots or frantically writing things down. We wanted you just to be able to listen and enjoy the presentation, so we have that for you in your packets.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I do hope you enjoy the presentation, except it should make you really mad because all of this stuff is really, as Gus was pointing out, is really just, maddening. So my job today is just to give an overview of Proposition 22, which was the ballot initiative that passed in California during this past election. And I think a lot of people have a general idea of what it is, but I'm going to talk about the specifics of it. And in particular, Proposition 22 was really, really sneaky. And it sort of seemed to grant things. And then when you look at when you look further in the document, you see that it's very, very insidious in the way that it really denies rights to people. So just to set the landscape, generally workplace laws protect employees and not independent contractors. That's why this employee independent contractor designation is so important. Whether you're talking about the minimum wage laws, the right to organize, workplace safety and health, anti-discrimination laws, all of the laws protect employees and generally not independent contractors. Some of the laws that are listed here and that I mentioned are under federal law, some are under state or local law, and some are a hybrid, like unemployment insurance is run by, it's administered by the states, but the federal government gives the money for administration. But overall, that is why this is a big deal, because workplace laws don't protect you generally if you're not an employee. So some of the basics of Proposition 22, what did it do? It made app-based drivers and delivery workers, it designated them as independent contractors, not employees, notwithstanding whatever other areas of law in the California Labor Code say. And it has four qualifications or factors that have to be met, but they're very easily met because Proposition 22 was written by the gig companies. So I'm going to share with you the text of Proposition 22. Remember, ordinary voters, ordinary people had to vote on this and assess it. So I'll just show it to you and you can take a look and see if you think it's accessible to ordinary voters to understand, what it is they're voting for. There it is. That is Proposition 22. It is 10 pages long, a really small font. I've been doing workers' rights law for a really long time, and it took me like half a day to understand it with a bunch of phone calls to California lawyers. It is really, really, and I still don't feel I understand all of it. So, the idea of putting a ballot initiative like this to voters and thinking that people could understand it, I think is a problem with the California system. And this example shows how it can really go awry. And in fact, there were post-election surveys that showed that 40% of early voters who voted yes on Proposition 22 said that they did so because they wanted to increase workers' wages. So people thought, a significant number of the yes voters, enough of them that would have been dispositive, thought they were helping workers with this and didn't understand the full entirety of what was happening. So it covers a number of different areas of law. I'm not going to speak in detail about every single thing because it is quite detailed, but I'll go into some of the major provisions of the law in some detail. So first of all, it says that companies are supposed to pay, these gig companies are supposed to pay workers 120% of the minimum wage per hour. So far that sounds pretty good. But what they do in Proposition 22 is that they define that money only has to be paid for what they call engaged time. And they define engaged time as the time between a worker receiving a request and dropping off the passenger if it's a ride, or dropping off the food or groceries. And that leaves out a huge amount of work time. That leaves out time that workers are available to work, that they, that they may be driving in between rides, in between shopping trips. This is of great value to the companies because their entire business model depends upon having a large pool of workers available to meet customers' demand in a really short time. And so all of that time that people are available to work and waiting for a request is not compensated. The example I always give is like a receptionist doesn't just get paid when there's a person at the front desk, right? They get paid when they're available. It also doesn't cover time when people are returning from a drop off. So if someone goes from a high volume area and drives an hour to a low volume area, they're not likely to get a ride back to that high volume area. And all of that return trip is not compensated. It's not included in engaged time. And then other time, like cleaning and sanitizing a car, filling up with gas, all kinds of maintenance, all of that is also not covered in engaged time. There was a study by the companies themselves, and they found that a third of the miles driven fall outside of engaged time. So what this means is that right away, even if they're paying 120% of minimum wage, it's only for 2/3 of work time. And it's important to note that 1/3 of miles driven fall outside of engaged time, but there are other things that don't count as miles driven, like gassing and cleaning a car. So if we even say that like 2/3 of time is compensated, that's probably an overstatement. Also, under Proposition 22, there's no overtime requirement. So to compare this with employees, employees have to be paid for all of their work time, not just an artificially reduced engaged time, and they get overtime after 40 hours a week. And California also has additional overtime after 8 hours a day. So I put together this chart that just gives a little bit of an idea at 30, 40, 50, and 60 hours of how much employees would make and how much people would make under Proposition 22. And this is just looking at pay. This isn't looking at reimbursements for vehicle expenses or any other issues, paid sick leave or all of the other things. This is just pay alone. And you can see that the differences, if you look at the chart, are quite significant. For 30 hours a week, it's a difference of $84, which is about 25%. The employee pay makes about 25% more than Proposition 22 pay. And as the hours go up because of overtime, it's even more drastic. And then I annualized it at 52 weeks. I don't know if people often, really work a full 52 weeks, if sometimes people have a week off, but just for the sake of math, I did 52 weeks. And you can see that like at 60 hours a week, it's almost, a person's making almost 1.5 times as much as an employee as under Proposition 22. Then another aspect of Proposition 22 is the vehicle cost reimbursement. So under California law, employers have to pay, like if workers spend money out of pocket for whatever they need to do business, to do the job, the employer has to reimburse all of that. What Proposition 22 says is that workers get 30 cents per mile for each mile of engaged time. And again, we see that engaged time definition doing a lot of work because you're already wiping out right off the top about 1/3 of the miles that someone is driving. On top of that, the 30 cents per mile is really, really extremely low. The IRS reimbursement rate is 57.5 cents per mile. There've been studies in Seattle and New York on the actual cost of ownership and operation for drivers for gig companies, and they found it to be much higher because the wear and tear is higher. Also because many workers buy the car, finance the cars specifically for this work. And so again, if you do the comparison, employees have to be paid for all of the expenses of operating the vehicle or whatever expenses they have to pay for their job. While Proposition 22, it's this artificially reduced amount. And so, as I think Gus mentioned, this works out. There was a study at the UC Berkeley that the actual pay under Proposition 22 works out to $5.64 per hour. And then there is the gig companies love to talk about portable benefits, and it's like very sparkly, and they love talking about the portable benefits and that they have this healthcare subsidy. And it is true that that's something, new and different. But what I found, I really studied this one carefully. And what I found is that when you look at the healthcare subsidy, if you just start scratching at the surface and looking under the hood and dissecting it, it really kind of gets whittled down to a very small amount. The way that it works, there's two levels. One is at 25 hours a week and one is at 15 hours a week. 25 hours a week, they get 100% of the California Bronze Plan, which is the lowest of 4 Affordable Care Act plans, health insurance plans in California. So if they work at least 25 hours a week, you get 100% after the quarter has ended, and 15 hours a week, you get 50%. But there's always a big but. First of all, probably you can already guess, some of you are predicting that the 25 hours a week, that's engaged time, right? So again, you would have to work a lot more hours in order to get to those threshold amounts. The craziest part, though, is that somewhere in the statute, it says it defines 100% of the subsidy, and it says 100% of the subsidy shall be defined as 82% of the subsidy. And they just take it right away and they define 100% as 82%, which I had to read a couple of times because it was just so, mind-boggling. The other thing is also you have to meet this threshold. And if you miss, it's over the period of a calendar quarter, so 13 weeks. If you make your threshold for all 12 weeks and then you miss 1 week because you're sick, you're going to miss that threshold. There's also a chicken and egg problem because in order to get the subsidy, you already have to show proof of insurance. Whereas obviously people need to have the subsidy in order to pay for the insurance. Not all insurance qualifies. So if someone has insurance through a second job or a spouse, it can't be used to defray those expenses. The subsidy is paid after the monthly insurance premiums are due. And again, that UC Berkeley study looked at the subsidy and figured out that it would end up equaling about $1.22 an hour, for 30 weekly hours, about $36 a week, which if you think about the charts I showed you a couple minutes ago, that's much, much less. The healthcare subsidy doesn't even begin to make the difference up in terms of how many fewer wages people are getting just because of this engaged time minimization. Paid leave, California law requires paid leave, paid sick leave, and paid family leave. Proposition 22 not only does not include this, but it also preempts local laws on paid sick days, which a number of California jurisdictions have passed. Unemployment insurance. Many of you are familiar with unemployment insurance. If people lose their jobs, you can get UI paying partial income for typically up to 26 weeks, and it's funded by a tax on employers. Proposition 22 exempts the set of workers, drivers and delivery workers for these companies from unemployment insurance coverage. So that means the workers cannot get unemployment insurance. That also means the gig companies do not have to pay unemployment insurance taxes like every other company in America. There's currently a temporary pandemic specific program that is giving gig workers some benefits, but that is being paid out of federal funds. And so what that kind of means is that all of us, the public, are paying for the unemployment benefits for gig workers instead of their own companies and employers, the way it works for everybody else. Workplace safety and health, which, I'll skip to the next slide just to get to the crux of it. California law, federal law and California law require employers to provide a safe workplace, and that includes providing personal protective equipment or PPE, as well as having a illness prevention and injury prevention plan. And Proposition 22 exempts workers from that law, has no workplace safety requirements of its own. So for example, it doesn't require companies to provide workers with masks or other COVID protections free of charge. And Gus mentioned this about flexibility, and I think we'll hear more later as well about the issue of flexibility. The companies really hammer hard on, that Proposition 22 safeguards scheduling flexibility, and that if we have to give workers employee status, they'll lose their flexibility. And just, I can say from a legal perspective, that's nonsense, because employees can have flexible or part-time hours. There is no law. They never point to a law that says employees can't have flexible hours, because there is no law that says employees can't have flexible hours. Lots of workers work part-time, lots of workers work with flexible hours. And in fact, a recent working paper about this industry found that even if they had to treat workers as employees, the gig companies would still need part-time hours because of demand fluctuations. So, they were saying in California, we'll make everybody have to work this rigid 40-hour work week. But the truth is that the demand really drives when people are working. In addition, the companies, in terms of flexibility, the companies exert a lot of control over workers. I think we'll probably hear more about that. A number of courts in a number of different states have found workers to be employees for that reason. In New York, where I live, our highest court found Postmates workers to be employees for our unemployment insurance taxes. And we have appellate courts that have found Uber drivers to be employees. So, there is extensive control. And then in addition, in terms of the flexibility, workers don't have the flexibility to set their own pay rate. They don't, as Gus sort of alluded to, if they want to make money, they don't really have flexibility because the customer demand really drives when the work hours happen, when workers are working. And then also, typically people can't know what the job is before accepting. So you can't just say, I only want to work in this area or this neighborhood. California law has anti-retaliation protections so that if people speak up, they can't be retaliated against. Proposition 22 has nothing of the sort. Also transparency, employers have to provide pay stubs, keep payroll records, produce them to the Labor Department, provide quarterly wages, report quarterly wages of workers. And this is a big problem with these companies in particular, is that they've been very reluctant to share data. And so none of this stuff is required under Proposition 22. And so, it's a big question. How can the impact of it be assessed for public policy purposes when there's not requirement that information be provided? And the last point that I'll make is that it's really hard to amend. Typically, a law can be changed if there's, changed circumstances like COVID, or if a statute's not working, or you need technical changes. Proposition 22 has this really bananas provision that bananas is a legal term of art. It has this provision that a full 7/8 of the California legislature have to approve any amendments or changes, which is really a nearly impossible hurdle. And it also creates an obstacle if the state were to want to legislate on collective bargaining, because there's a specific provision that says if the state wants to legislate on collective bargaining, it also is subject to that 7/8. So this is an op-ed that I wrote that I think is in the materials, saying, what happened in California is a cautionary tale for us all. I know the gig companies are getting ready to fight in a number of different states. I believe Illinois is one of them, to try and pass something similar. They present it as something really positive, that it's like the third way and futuristic. And I think it really is, even though the numbers of workers, if you look at it statistically, the numbers of workers who are in these kinds of jobs is relatively limited relative to the entirety of the US workforce. But I think it really is a very dangerous very, very dangerous development. And just to give a couple of other examples, in Massachusetts, the state AG's office got settlements with two platform-based companies. One of them placed dental hygienists and one of them placed education workers and treated them as independent contractors. And then I recently learned of a new company that started in Canada, which I thought was supposed to be much better than this, but called Staffy. Sorry, I live in New York City, if you hear the fire engine. A company called Staffy that is placing healthcare workers and restaurant workers in these kind of gig independent contractor positions. And then of course there's the workers in California who were the unionized grocery workers I don't know if they were unionized stores. I don't know if I've read different things about whether the workers themselves who were let go, but they were employees who were let go and replaced by DoorDash workers. So I think it's really important to protect the workers. This is not just this is just the start. And I think it's really important to try and keep it in California. Anyhow, thank you for listening. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them, and I'm really eager to hear the other speakers.
Terry, thank you so much. That was phenomenal. And I think it's really good that we put that PowerPoint in the packet, because that'll give us a chance to really look at it more and at length. But thank you for that. It was just to echo what you said. If you think that this is going to stop at California, or if you think that this is going to stop with folks that are delivering food or serving as taxi type of transportation, then you're missing a big part of the story, because it definitely has the potential to grow quite a bit. We'll talk more about that later. So next up, one second, I just have to pull up his bio. Next up, we are going to hear, well, before I do that, I wanted to take a quick moment and thank Allison. Allison Fries Williams works here in Champaign with me. She was very helpful in putting this together, getting our registration link up, keeping all our ducks in a row, making sure you got the Zoom link, sending, you multiple reminders that you had that Zoom link, because we all know we need those today. So thank you very much to Allison for helping us coordinate this event. Allison is also recording this event, so that if if you would like to reference it again, we'll have that potential. So our next speaker is going to take the conversation from California and move it here to Illinois. And Frank Manzo IV, I believe, is our first speaker who doesn't have his own radio show, but we won't hold that against him. He is the policy director of the Illinois Economic Policy Institute. He has served as the at Alepi for 8 years. And prior to that, he worked at the University of Illinois School of Labor and Employment Relations and at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, which is where I'm from. He earned a Master of Public Policy from the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy and a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and Political Science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His research interests include labor market analysis, economic development, infrastructure investment, and the low-wage labor force in public finance. And I could just say this, and this might be a personal bias, but there's very few people right now in the country that are doing as much research on as many topics that relate to working people as Frank. The level of research that is being churned out by the Illinois Economic Policy Institute is really quite amazing and very much needed right now. So he is going to speak to us about the latest report, a report that literally just got finished and came out today. So you are the first folks that are hearing about it, and it is about gig work in Chicago. So Frank, it is now your turn, and I encourage you to think about starting a radio program.
Yeah, well, we'll see about that. But thank you for that introduction, Stephanie. I'm up here in the corner or down here, wherever I am on your screen. I just wanted to make sure you guys could all see who I am before I share my screen, and I'm going to be sharing a PowerPoint. But of course, yes, I am Frank Manzo IV, and I do serve as the policy director of the Illinois Economic Policy Institute. Again, we're a nonprofit research organization that promotes thoughtful economic growth for businesses and working families. But yes, I am very excited to talk about this new study that we are releasing with Professor Robert Bruno from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, who of course you heard from earlier. And the study, which is called On-Demand Workers Sub-Minimum Wages, actually takes advantage of the fact that the city of Chicago has collected and released information on more than 169 million rideshare trips within the city of Chicago limits. And that data goes back to November of 2018, so a couple of years. As you can see on the screen, that's the report. The report's in your packet. And then you can see the Chicago data portal on the screen that we take this data from. And I want to note that the city uses this term transportation network providers. That's the term they use to describe the industry. There are currently only 3 transportation network providers that are registered with the city, and those are Uber, Lyft, and Via. Via is a little smaller, so throughout this report, I'll primarily refer to Uber and Lyft. Now, before I get to our findings, I do want to briefly mention, what I think are kind of 3 big takeaways that the small but kind of really growing body of economic research on these transportation network providers says, and most of this research focuses on Uber. First, and this was the early part of this research, I think before people got to see a little bit more of the cons and how little flexibility is offered. But the research initially was showing, hey, the gig economy, it's great. It provides some flexibility for workers. And there's really no denying that people, at least initially, were attracted to Uber because it offers flexibility. Most of these workers work in a part-time kind of status, often supplementing their main job. But then second, despite this flexibility, or maybe even because of it, these app-based companies, pay very low wages for workers. Estimates vary, but I'd say in the research, the very best ones that actually account for vehicle expenses and taxes generally show that Uber drivers only earn between $9 and $16 an hour. Many of them earn less than the minimum wage. And then finally, there's just an important and increasing body of research that shows there are some social consequences, of course, to this industry. I think this, I'm expecting this part of the research to expand, but as an example, workers in the industry are 10% less likely to have health insurance coverage, and that likely leads to higher Medicaid costs for all of us, right? There's other research that's actually found that women earn less than men driving for Uber, even though it's the exact same work. So if this is the quote future of work, it's not going to help in closing the gender pay gap. Okay, so now back to our study. Professor Bruno and I wanted to understand how much Uber and Lyft drivers actually earn in Chicago. Right, we got a lot of these estimates. They're from Seattle, they're from Denver in some cases, they're national. But what about Chicago? As we know, I don't have to go too much over this, as Terry mentioned most of it. These Uber and Lyft drivers are currently considered independent contractors, and that means that they lose the basic labor protections that Terry mentioned. And it's possible, of course, for these workers to earn less than the minimum wage. Now, our first step in our study is to find out how many workers are registered with the city to drive for Uber and Lyft. And we find that in 2019, there were about 110,000 drivers who were registered, but only about 72,000 of them were active, meaning that they recorded just one trip, right? One fare trip. They did one job, right? At least. And this is the data for the month of September that we primarily looked at. Now, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, however, we see a significant drop in 2020, which is what you might expect. Only 29,000 drivers were still registered and working in September 2020. This is about a 60% drop in active drivers compared to the year before. And but that being said, I should say that there is an interesting finding in that for the Uber and Lyft drivers who were still working, they actually averaged about the same number of monthly trips in 2020 as they did back in 2019. The data shows us that, well, basically, here's what I want to say. That we know that the demand or the ridership fell. But this data shows us that, as we might expect, supply or the number of drivers also fell. But it also indicates that those who remained employed completed about as many trips as they were doing pre-pandemic, something we're not fully expecting to see. But so we have that data. Now we need the trip data. The good news is that the city of Chicago releases a lot of information. The bad news is that neither Professor Bruno's project nor my small nonprofit really has the computing power to analyze all 169 million rides. We just can't do it. So what we did was we took a sample of trips. And we did 3 specific days in the middle of September, and we focused on 6 specific pickup times during those 3 days. And those times were separated by about 4 hours each. You can kind of see that at the bottom of the screen there. But we have some trips during morning commutes, evening commutes, during the lunch hour, and then all the downtime in between. And our total sample includes about 78,000 trips. So a very good sample size. But here, again, on the screen, we see a huge, expected impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Not only was there a 61% drop in passenger trips for the same exact days and the same exact times compared to a year before, but the average trip distance also fell slightly by like 5%. the time it took to get from point A to point B also decreased significantly. And we're able to do some algebra to find out that it's because, as you might expect, there was less traffic congestion on the road. That becomes important, but the finding is that drivers drove 16% faster because the roads were more open, so a couple miles an hour faster. Now here's a troubling finding. Passenger tips plummeted by 39% during the pandemic. Okay, so previous research has actually found that only about 1 out of every 6 Uber rides results in a tip for the driver. To me, that's already a shocking finding, but our data unfortunately corroborate that finding. Before the pandemic, 21%, or about 1 out of every 5 rides, produced a tip. During the pandemic, the tip rate fell to just 14%, or 1 out of every 7 rides. This could be for a lot of reasons. It could be because more passengers were out of work and had less money to tip. But whatever the case, these are frontline, face-to-face workers at high risk of getting infected by the virus, and their tips went down. Okay, so we have a lot of information, including how much time drivers spent with passengers in their vehicles. And we also know from a consulting report funded by Uber and Lyft that drivers in Chicago spend about 55% of their time with passengers in their vehicles. So 55%. The rest is either driving to pick up passengers or waiting for ride hails. So we can use this data to calculate that the average driver works between 700 and 900 hours per year. That's part-time, right? And they earn, somewhere in that chart, you might be able to see a little less than $17,000 in gross income annually. But note that this is income before the drivers pay for vehicle expenses. So we need to estimate those vehicle expenses. And it's not 30 cents, right? That was the last presentation. It's not 30 cents. What we do is we pull data from 2 very highly authoritative sources. One is the US Department of Energy, which has average weekly gas prices for Chicago dating back all the way to 2000. And the other is AAA, a national automotive services and insurance company, which annually publishes articles on the per mile costs of driving for the average car in America. So we use Department of Energy and AAA data and their estimates on fuel, maintenance and repair, and vehicle depreciation costs per mile. And we do, Terry mentioned this in the last piece, we do actually exclude some other costs associated with owning a car. So financing the car, paying for registration fees. The reason we do that is to be conservative, and because the majority of drivers are part-time and would be paying those expenses anyway if they were not driving for Uber and Lyft. But for those drivers that do purchase a car specifically for the purpose of driving Uber and Lyft, this cost estimate is too low. Anyways, in total, we find that the total cost incurred by Uber and Lyft drivers is between 51 cents and 53 cents per mile. This is close to, but slightly below the IRS tax deduction per mile. It would probably be match it and exceed it if you included those who buy the car specifically for the purpose of their work. Now, because we have both, the miles that the drivers drove and the hours that they worked, we can convert these per mile costs that you see to per hour costs. And we do that next. After accounting for expenses and the self-employment payroll taxes that, an independent contractor must pay, Professor Bruno and I find that the average Uber and Lyft driver in Chicago earned $12.30 an hour in 2019. Okay, this is below the $13 minimum wage in the city for that year. Now, things, if you actually look in the next column, things actually look a little better in 2020, which is a weird sentence to say. The average driver appears to earn $15.09 per hour in W-2 equivalent wages. But Professor Bruno and I note that this estimate is actually artificially inflated for one important reason, and it's that the drivers did not experience the usual levels of traffic congestion in this city. Okay, so basically, because they were able to get places faster, they could complete more trips in the same amount of time. When traffic levels return to normal, I mean, this $15 is not gonna hold. They will not be able to complete as many trips per hour. That's just the reality, but it means that they will earn less per hour as a result. So what we do is we run this separate analysis that finds that if the average Uber and Lyft driver in Chicago faced pre-pandemic traffic, they would have only earned $13.62 per hour last year, which is, again, below the minimum wage, which was $14 at the time, or I guess it still is $14. It's worth noting two things here. First, we did not assume that gas prices would have been higher. They probably would have, right? Because there would have been more demand with more cars on the road. But again, for a conservative assumption, even with that built in, it's $13.62. It could be lower. And then the other thing to note is that, of course, that the minimum wage is rising to $15 in July of this year. So what are the implications for state and local elected officials? A lot of the things we've been talking about. But first and foremost, it's clear that the treatment of Uber and Lyft drivers as independent contractors suppresses their earnings and shifts income from workers to the executives and shareholders of these companies. Two potential policy approaches do kind of emanate from these findings that Professor Bruno and I have come up with. The first is kind of at the state level, where state lawmakers could classify these drivers as employees. Now, that's a lot of what we're talking about today. They would grant them full employment rights and access to these basic labor protections. The two I want to focus on are, of course, the minimum wage laws and unemployment insurance benefits. Classifying these drivers as employees means that it would ensure that Uber and Lyft are paying their fair share into Illinois' unemployment insurance system, which their workers have been able to pull benefits from during the pandemic. And it would also, of course, ensure that the drivers earn at least the minimum wage, because if their fares plus tips do not equal $15 an hour, it's on the companies to make up the difference. Now, second, I'm sorry about that on the screen there. The second is this is a more local approach. It doesn't require kind of an AB5 type legislation, but has been done in other states. And that's that elected officials in Chicago could incorporate what's often called a minimum driver pay standard into the Chicago Transportation Network Providers Ordinance. Little wordier there. But into that ordinance, we can incorporate this, which would increase the average net pay to ensure that it is at or above $15 an hour after expenses. And we can, of course, look to a couple examples, but really the main example right now is the example of New York City, which implemented its pay standard in 2019, so at the beginning of last year. And after New York City implemented the policy, driver pay increased by 8%, and passenger wait times actually decreased. So it's better for the passengers. And there was a small increase in the base fare that was charged to those passengers, but the higher price did not result in a major drop in people hailing rides. In fact, the only drops that did occur really occurred in areas with the highest access to public transit. So it seems like people just moved to public transit. And those drops were not enough to offset the wage gains for these workers. And perhaps just as important, I say there was a small price increase. Uber and Lyft commission rates fell in the city, meaning that the corporations absorbed part of the increase in costs instead of passing it on to consumers. So they're gonna scare people and saying, oh, prices are gonna go up. What they did in New York is absorb some of those costs themselves. I think my time is just about up. So my final thought, and there's a lot of data, I apologize, but it's good study. I encourage you all to read it in your packet and on our websites in the next day or two, right? But the final thought that I would like to leave you with is that, although we still need to know more, especially regarding the impact of like food delivery and grocery delivery services, things like Uber Eats and Postmates and Instacart. What we know now is that Uber and Lyft drivers struggle to earn the minimum wage in Chicago. Right now, the status quo embeds a low wage contingent labor force into our economy. But there are options that elected officials could consider to promote fairness and boost worker earnings. That's my presentation. I want to thank you all for your time. You have my email on the screen that I'll take off shortly. So feel free to take that. There's our website, and you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. But thank you, everybody. And thanks, Professor Bruno, for being an excellent co-author on this study, as always.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Next up, we're going to hear from two drivers. We think that it's the labor education program, we take very seriously that if we're going to be talking about work, anytime that we're going to be talking about labor, that it is very, very important to center the voices of the people who actually do that work in the conversation. So thank you. I want to thank the Chicago Gig Alliance, who helped us connect with these workers, and to Lori Simmons, who helped facilitate that. So thank you very much to Lori. The two drivers that we're going to hear from today are Andrew McLaurin. Andrew lives in Chicago's Roseland neighborhood on the far south side. He drives Uber full-time and has been driving for 5 years. And he has been associated with the Gig Alliance since 2019. And we're also going to hear from Lisa Caluette, who is a writer and a gig worker from Chicago, Illinois. She has watched wages in the gig economy steadily decline, even as the job becomes more dangerous due to crime and the ongoing pandemic. And I think that's important to note that the pandemic didn't only impact drivers in terms of loss of ride share, right? But it also in real ways, gig workers are frontline workers. And I think that it's important that we think about them as in those terms. She has been affiliated with the Chicago Gig Alliance since 2020. I didn't ask which one of you wanted to speak first, and I probably should have, so I will just let you decide. Whoever is going to go first.
I guess I'll go first then. Okay, I'm Andrew McLaurin, and I'm learning a lot as we speak, as far as all the data and information you guys have put out there from Mr. Augustus and everyone else that actually came in and did the data. And I mean, I'm wowed in certain ways by it. But I mean, me as a driver, I've been driving 5 years, and yes, that's what attracted me to the gig economy at the time. I was actually I had started working. I worked for about a month. Then I found out I was having like kidney issues. I was going to have to go on dialysis. So I had to do that. And I really couldn't work a regular job anymore, like far as construction jobs and some of the other things I was doing. So it actually helped me far as the flexibility, it really did help me. And like I said, when I first started 5 years ago, yes, you can go out there and make a decent amount of money. But as the years gone on, you notice you're out longer and longer for more hours, and you're driving further, and then they change the way they pay you, and it was just a lot. It was like, I don't know, I don't know if you guys ever played a game called Spades, but they'll say you pencil whooping me. They'll whoop you with all this legislation and different fees, and we're gonna pay you this way and that way, and you get confused, like, wait, what? we decided we're going to look out for you so much that we're going to screw you out of this money. But guess what? You got more trips, you know? So, I mean, that's what I've experienced. I mean, we're out here, we're working, we have to pay insurance. I pay extra insurance because I've heard these horror stories of drivers getting hit, and you know, the insurance companies are going back and forth with each other, and you're screwed out of a car. You know, your job is pretty much over with. So I try to pay the extra insurance so that I could be covered, because I don't know what my insurance company is going to do to me if something actually happens. So, I mean, there's that. And then there's the maintenance on the vehicle, you know, driving. My car has almost 300,000 miles on it. It's a 2014. So, I mean, I'm doing an oil change almost every month, but I'm receiving less wages than I did back in 15 and 16. And I'm working more hours. I'm going out further. I'm getting jobs now, especially during the pandemic, where I'm driving 20 minutes away and you get there, it's a 5-minute trip or something like that. Now, if you're like what they call a diamond or a gold driver, you're supposed to know how long that trip is going to be. But if you decline those long trips, then they drop your status down below the diamond and platinum status. So it's like it's no point in that. They play these little like almost like video game type prizes with you. You know, yeah, you can see how far you're going, but if you don't take those trips, you won't be able to see that. You know, so I mean, you have a driver, you're debating, okay, this ride is 20 minutes away. Should I take it or shouldn't I take it? If I don't take it, I might end up penalized if I decline too many of these. And even far as with the Uber Eats, you go somewhere, you sit in McDonald's driving lot for 15 minutes, and then they're paying you $2. I've seen the rates decline on that, so I've turned Uber Eats off as a driver because it pays crappy wages. You know, it's just, I mean, it is a lot. Like I said, and then on top of that, with the pandemic, you worried about getting jacked for your car now, you know, and then Illinois just did something with the laws where it's like they're not going to really even penalize these people, like a cashless bail and all that. And it's like, so pick me up and then probably be out in a day or two. You know, it's crazy. Then you have the guys that will sit here, the customers, guys and gals, that you drive them around, then the next day you get a complaint that your car smell like weed, and then you're off for 3 or 4 days while they so-called investigate. And the investigation doesn't come with you taking a drug test or anything like that. They just lay you off for 3 days. So now you're really not making any money. And then they say, okay, after the investigation, okay, yeah, you can go back to working. But hell, I'm not compensated for that. Did this person get penalized for lying on me? I've offered. Hey, I'll come down and take a drug test right now. No, there's no need for that. I'm like, well, you guys have to have some way for people to clear their name. I mean, we have dash cams and everything set up, but they don't even take the evidence from that. And it gets ridiculous. So, I mean, did you guys have any other questions for me?
Andrew, yeah, definitely. We will let's have Lisa talk, and then we'll open it up for everybody for questions.
Okay, yeah, I didn't want to take up all the time, but yeah, because I can go on.
No, okay. Great. No, thank you very much. I appreciate your respect. And it's good. I mean, it's not good, but it's good to hear what it's actually like driving, right? I mean, because I feel like the data is very important, but the actual what it's actually like is you don't always get that from the numbers, right? And so thank you so much for sharing with us. So next we'll have Lisa, and then we'll open it up for some questions. Lisa.
Hi. So I started driving in 2014. Actually, my very first day for Uber was St. Patrick's Day. And so I was out there and it was a blast. I made $300 and something. I was super excited. And I started, because I love to drive. Love to write, love to drive, and I love to hear people's stories. So it was great because everybody was different. There was no ride that was the same. I met some amazing people from all over the world, and it was just really great. And then what happened was Uber started to lower their rates and tell you you're going to make more money. So I'm getting less to take a person from here to there, but I'm supposed to make more money. So it's like, so now you're peeing on my leg and trying to tell me it's raining. So there was that. And then, so basically, it was very clear to me when one day I kept getting a big groups. It was in the winter and it was big groups. So eventually I just put my coat in the trunk. And so somewhere along the way, somebody took my coat out the trunk. And so I contacted Uber and I was like, hey, can you just send a letter, whatever, you know, somebody accidentally, you know, because there were passengers from the airport and so forth and so on. You know, they just might have accidentally took my winter coat. They were like, yeah, we don't do that. So I understood very clearly that I was just a car. You don't even know my name. You don't even care to know my name. So from there, I had a really bad taste in my mouth and I transitioned over to Lyft. And Lyft was a gentler, kinder place. You know, they pretend to care about you. They even had these incentives where that 20% would go back if you did so many rides and then you did so many rides during a specific time. That money, that 20%, they would reimburse you and give it back to you, which was great because I typically always made that. But then they changed it. So then they wanted you to do more rides, and then they wanted you to do more rides overnight. And I didn't do a lot of overnight because I'm a female, I'm alone. I'm not interested in carrying a gun. I don't know, you know what I mean? So there was that whole uncomfortability. So then now my whole income has dropped significantly. And then on top of that, on a really busy day, someone slammed into the back of me. So now I'm injured and I'm out of commission. And I can't get unemployment. I can't get workman's comp. So luckily for me, I'm married. And we were able to, you know, continue on. But it was a significant loss in income. And that was just that. So during that time though, I was on Facebook, it was a lot of Facebook groups, but during that time, there were a lot of carjackings that weren't making the news of Uber and Lyft drivers. So I understood that they finally figured it out because the companies don't even try to protect you as far as making sure that the person that's on there is a real person, the whole ID, none of that. So a woman will call for a ride and then a guy will get in the car. That happened to me in one of the few times that I did overnight. And I've never been afraid, luckily, knock on wood, I've never been afraid, but this guy made me uncomfortable. And I was taking him to an area that was a rough area. So what I did is I made sure he knew my name. I kept repeating my name. I kept saying, if your intention is to hurt me, I'm not just some faceless, you know, object that you just needed the car or you just wanted whatever possession of mine that you wanted. This is my name. What's your name? And so the vibe changed in the car and there was no issue. And I eventually, you know, I dropped him off. It was 3 a.m. and I went home. So basically, my biggest issue with them is like Andrew said, they just change the amount and that's it. Or like he said, they'll just deactivate you for no reason. That never happened to me, but it happened to a lot of people. And also too, there's no safety. There are no safety plans. You want a female to drive overnight, but you don't even set it up where she could just pick up female riders. Not to say that that's a complete safety net, but I take my chances one-on-one, me with another woman. You know what I mean? So it's just a lot of things that and then they don't want you to have a weapon in the car, your car. They don't want you to have a weapon in the car, not even mace, not even, some of the smallest things to protect yourself, and they do nothing to protect you. So I stopped doing rideshare. I did do DoorDash for a while, but there's very little money in DoorDash right now, unless you're willing to work late at night or during like the evening rush or when it's really bad weather. So all of that, I'm pretty much kind of transitioning out of gig work. So that's pretty much my story.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for sharing it. And when hearing from both of you, you brought up perspectives and things that I would never have thought about. And so it's just, and I think just listening to both of you, we have Bob and Frank on this call. I think maybe we might have some ideas for our next study, right? Based on some of the things that you talked about. What I'm supposed to do now is, and I'm only going to do this really, really briefly, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. I'm supposed to talk about why we should care and where this is going. So hopefully, and I think, we have an audience that's on this forum that cares. In other words, you wouldn't be here, right? But I think thinking about broader why we should care. So first of all, just the fundamental fact that all workers deserve a decent wage and the ability to go home to their families at night and be safe. But also, I think that we are kidding ourselves. I know a lot of folks on this forum are members of existing labor unions, right? And you might have the question, how does the gigification of the economy matter, not just to these workers, but also to my members? And I think one of the things that Terry said is it's already happening. Like there's already efforts to gigify, she mentioned dental hygienists, healthcare workers, educators. If we think that this isn't going to spread, this model of work and this ability to try to skirt existing labor law, because I want us to be very clear, that's what this is doing, right? Is going to spread and going to continue. And as Gus mentioned, this is a significant part of the labor force in this country. It's a significant part of the labor force in Chicago. It is a labor force that is overrepresented by people of color. And for all of those reasons, this is something why we're spending so much time on this right now with the labor education program is this is something that should concern us all within the labor movement. No matter what sector of the labor movement you're in, it should concern us all. So where this is going, I just wanted to mention a few things. Prop 22 in California was the most expensive proposition ballot measure in the history of the United States. If the various gig economies who backed that proposition spent upwards of $200 million on that proposition getting it passed. So let us be clear, they would not have spent that much money if they didn't think it benefited their bottom lines. Another way that you could know that is true is as soon as it passed, DoorDash announced that they were going to go public and sell their company's stocks in an IPO. A lot of analysis of this has been about the fact that they were trying to get it in during the pandemic because DoorDash in particular, right, is a service in the pandemic. And I think that was part of it. What I think some of the folks that do that analysis of why, stocks is also that they won a major victory in California. Now, what's a little bit different about Illinois and California is California, the way they have way more propositions there where they put these 10-page things on the ballot. And I can attest to what Terry said. I have friends who are in the labor movement who I've talked to, and I was like, how did this fail? Or how did this pass? And they said, well, I know I voted wrong. I thought I understood it. I thought I voted right, and I voted wrong. I've had that conversation with multiple people. And so the thing is it was intentionally confusing. Now, let's be clear, that isn't going to happen in Illinois in the same way because we don't have that proposition system. But what we do know is that in June, these gig companies formed a PAC, political action PAC called Illinoisans for Independent Work, and in our last election cycle have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. So we know it's not theoretical that they're going to come to Illinois next. They're already in Illinois, and they want to ensure that the victory that in their minds that they gained in California can be duplicated here. So that's what they're doing. A few things that I think that we need to do are, one, we need to ensure that we continue this conversation. We have a lot of people here, but my challenge to all of you is look around and figure out who isn't in this room, especially leaders from the labor movement and leaders in the community organizations, because one of the things that they did in California that was super tricky is they got groups that typically you would think of that would be on the side of workers or on the side of civil rights, and they got them to support the proposition and sort of muddy the waters by using very tricky language. So we need to have that conversation now about what's really at stake. So we're going to do another one of these forums. We're going to have probably a different slate of guests, but we'll be covering the same topic. And Bob, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it is February 18th, I believe. So we'll do one in February because we want to continue this conversation and continue the research. Two, and I think this is incredibly important, and I said this before, both of our gig worker guests spoke, is we need to center the voices of workers. They need to drive this conversation. They need to be at the front of this conversation, and we need to make sure that any sort of solutions, right, to the gigification of the economy that we're presenting actually listens to workers on the ground and what they're experiencing and what they say we should be doing, right, in order to improve working conditions. So those are my two thoughts. And so now we're going to open it up for questions. So if you have questions, you could do one of two things. You could type it in the chat, or if you are, and you could, direct it to everybody or direct it to somebody specific. Or I think by now we've all been on Zoom enough. If you know how to raise your little blue hand, we could unmute your mic, or, you could just wave and we'll try to see you. We will try not to speak over each other, but does anybody have any questions?
Hi, my question is for Lisa and Andrew. One, thank you all for sharing your story. But I was wondering, I'm wondering what the contracts look like when you signed up to be a driver. Like, were they incredibly confusing? Did you feel like you knew what you were getting into? And it also sounds like it was just ever changing. So I'm wondering how they updated you when there were changes.
So for me, it was sort of like, I'm signing up and it's just like you just scroll down and hit I agree. So to be honest with you, I never actually read it, but when they changed the rate, it would be something that you just needed to hit I agree if you wanted to work. You know what I mean? So if you're logging in to work, you're ready to go, you got to hit I agree before you can work. So then I never saw, from the amendment to the contracts.
Yes, it's lawyer language pretty much. I'm not an attorney. You get this thing and it says go on or you can't work. It's usually a forced arbitration clause in there too, but then you can go and opt out later on. But they do it like every couple months, they update the contract. And usually when they update the contract, it's not in favor of the driver. We know that it's in favor of the company, some way to keep them from being sued or some other issue, pretty much. Like I said, it's generally somebody with their hand in your pocket, pretty much. So, But yeah, it's pretty much lawyer language. And you just check on it and then you're ready to roll. You're ready to go on.
Thank you.
This is Frank, one of the speakers. I also have a question for you two, Lisa and Andrew. And this finding on tips that we found, it's like roughly 1 out of every 5 trips, or even less during the pandemic. Is that kind of your experience? Did you get tipped every ride? If not, how often did you get tipped? Just curious what your guys' personal experiences are with that.
No, no, you don't get tipped every ride. And then sometimes you won't see the tip until the next day. But a lot of times it's, oh, I'll tip you on the app, and sometimes it never comes. Some people will give you cash, but sometimes you don't get the tip. You don't get a tip like from every ride, probably every 5 rides. It just depends on that night. Like maybe on the weekend you'll get more tips in my experience, but yeah, it's not a lot of tipping, especially now during this pandemic. I can kind of understand that, but like we also supposed to get premiums for driving all these minutes and miles to get to the customer. A lot of times that doesn't show up either. It'll say possible premium, which is supposed to be extra money for going to that customer, but you don't really get that when you go and look up your payment and breakdown, it doesn't show up. So no, like I said, tipping very rare.
When I started early when Uber hadn't been here as long. And so they told passengers that our tip was already worked into the rate. So that was one of the things that really ticked me off with Uber is they were basically encouraging them not to tip. With Lyft, it was a lot better. But I always wondered, were they taking some of my tips? Because I felt like I should get tipped every ride because I drove everybody the same way. So why would one person tip me $5 and 3 people not tip me anything? So that was the same thing I found out with DoorDash because I did that the same way as well. And then I wasn't getting any tips, were occasional tip here and there. Then I found out they were just taking our tips, period. I was a part of a class action suit. So now I'm getting a check somewhere in February.
I have a question, Terry, for you. As somebody who has studied Prop 22 and what happened in California so closely, do you have any thoughts or advice for all of us in Illinois who are, on the, and just to be clear, what happened is Prop 22 was in response to a law that was passed that actually gave employment status to gig workers. And Prop 22, Lyft, DoorDash, Uber, they didn't much care for that law. So Prop 22 was their response to get the public to say, nah, we don't have to do that. And so that was sort of what happened. So do you have any words of wisdom for us over here in Illinois?
So I should just say, to be clear, I'm an East Coast person. I'm like a New Yorker, and I'm affiliated with these East Coast institutions. So what I know about the lessons learned from California are from like webinars that I've attended where people have shared their lessons from California. I do think a couple of things, that the background that you were referring to is that there was a court case, Dynamics, that adopted this. Basically, the test for independent contractor versus employee has traditionally been this, like, there's different tests for each law, but it's this like, multi-factor test, and no one factor is dispositive. And it's just like, a multitude of factors. And so there's a test called the ABC test, which is a much more clear, direct test. It is much better. you know, from my perspective as someone who has spent many, many years enforcing workplace laws, employers often say, we just want clarity. We want to know. We don't want to have to litigate this. And from that perspective, the ABC test makes it very clear. It has sort of a presumption of employment status. You know, if you find these, you know, in order to find that someone's an independent contractor, it makes it harder to do that. But what happened was the California Supreme Court passed, you know, adopted this test, and then the legislature passed AB 5, a law that adopted the test, and then that sort of like brought all of this to a head. I would note also that the California AG's office and 3, I think it was county or city attorneys, sued Uber and Lyft for misclassification under AB 5. So it was sort of like, it was like, you know, their game was over. Like they had sued to undo it. They just kept losing. So I guess the question that you're sort of hinting or suggesting here is like, is it better to not like poke the bear by passing something? Is that sort of what you're asking a little bit? Like, or is it?
Or not necessarily that, but like what should we be doing now? I guess what should, you know, there's a lot of folks on here that are labor researchers or labor leaders. You know, we've got some retirees and some current labor leaders on this call. What should we be doing right now?
So, you know, I think that's a big question that all of us have to collectively figure out, right? Like all of it, you know, and a larger group of people. Some of the things that immediately, I'll answer with some thoughts since you asked me, but like, I wish I had the perfect answer. Some immediate things. One is that in New York and Seattle, both of those driver pay standards were established after there was a lot of data and studies about what drivers actually make. You know, so I think one thing is like, you know, these companies are really do not want to disclose their information, and just like to the extent that there any policy making that happens should be evidence-based, right? So that's one thing. You know, I think addressing those strange bedfellows who supported Proposition 22, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, like the NAACP, like trying to nip that stuff in the bud, I think is really important as well. You know, whether the goal is to kind of, I don't know the state of Illinois current law in terms of like like in New York, we have some case law finding that they're employees under our unemployment insurance law. So that's one sort of landscape. In Illinois, if you don't have anything like that, you know, there's sort of a question, you know, a question I have is like, are you playing defense or are you playing offense? And that's more of like a political question in a way than a legal question, really. But I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on, I think getting the legislature, to the extent there's not a ballot initiative opportunity, getting the legislature really pinned down and solid, you know, opposing this and, you know, and not passing something like this is so important. And if they can pass something that's affirmatively, you know, like AB 5, if like you have the votes and you have the ability to do that, I think that's great. You know, if not, like slowing it down by, you know, study commission or whatever, you know, because I feel like these companies feel like they have momentum right now. And I think stopping that momentum is really important. But I'd love to hear other people's thoughts. And again, I think just like building the coalitions, getting workers involved, getting, you know, as many people and organizations as possible involved, is it, you know, will be so important. And again, just like pinning down in the legislature that like they will not let this happen in Illinois.
Thank you. Thank you, Terry, so much for that. We got another question from Jake, who asked, how much contact do Uber, DoorDash, etc. drivers have with one another? Are there Facebook groups or any sort of association, or is each driver pretty much an island by themselves with no guidance, mentorship, or forum? Lisa and Andrew, could you give us some input on that?
So when I started with Lyft, they did have someone that you had to do this ride. You had to do this ride with. So they were like a mentor, like you would have to drive. They went to see how well you drove. And they would go over things, you know, on their platform. And so that was cool. But there are Facebook groups, and you have to prove that you are a rideshare by sending your log on picture or whatever. So passengers couldn't get in our group, which is how I found out about the carjackings or attempted carjackings. Those were in those Facebook groups. But when you're out there by yourself, you're just on an island. You know, when you're out there working, you're on an island. You know, and I had always suggested to them that they needed a panic button, at least on the app, for women, you know, if it was well, period, guys too, because a girl killed a guy, you know, a couple of years ago in Lyft in Illinois. So, and I was out driving that night, you know, I could have got that pickup. But anyway, I'm just saying, so when you're out there, you're on an island, you're by yourself.
There are groups on Facebook. Gig Workers Alliance comes to mind. Uber and Lyft drivers of Chicago, Gig Workers United. There are quite a few groups. You just have to go on Facebook and just search for Uber and Lyft groups and gig workers type groups. They're all on Facebook. I'm sure the Amazon drivers, the Eats, all of us are. We talk daily in different groups. I'm like part of 4 or 5 groups myself online. So yes, it's ways to communicate. But like she said, it's when you're out there driving, especially me, I drive overnight. You're on your own pretty much. I mean, so you have to do whatever you need to do to protect yourself. And I've had some of those rides where it's somebody named Mary and somebody named Chuck shows up at your car. You don't know they have your profile picture and all this stuff, your plate number and all of that stuff as a driver, but you don't know who's coming to your car, you know, and then you'll get calls from people with the scam stuff. You're driving and then here comes a number, supposedly Uber or Lyft calling, and you supposed to answer it. And it's just a lot of stuff you deal with out there. And yes, you're pretty much on your own. You know, you're not protected. Like I said, you don't really know who's coming to your car because they could be ordering it for the boyfriend or the girlfriend or whoever, you know, or it could be just somebody scamming with somebody's credit card. It's, you know, I suggest some type of identifier a few minutes before they come out or something that they should have to have too as customers. We need to be safe too. I have 5 children and a wife. I want to be able to go home to them too. You know, if somebody wants my car, they can have that, but don't take my life for it. You know, so yes, you're pretty much out there on your own. So I mean, you do what you have to do. I'm not telling nobody to carry a gun or whatever, but you do what you have to do to protect yourself. And if something looks shady to you, then you drive off.
Thank you, Andrew. Another call that we got, or another question that we got, came from Christopher, who asked, "What should we be watching out in order to fight this?" I think that one thing, I'll start with an answer and then I'll kick it to everybody else. Is one, if you see an ad or a mailer or something from Illinois for independent work, just know, because they have to put it legally if they paid for something, that is the group of people that are from the companies. So be careful of that. If you do use the services, one of the things that was very interested in California is they actually use the app to reach gig customers in order to advocate for their position on the law. So watch out for that. So those are 2 things that we should watch for. But I'll just open it up to, you know, to anybody else. Andrew, Lisa, Terry, Gus, Bob, Frank. Do you have any suggestions of things we should look out for? Gus, I see you unmuted.
I don't think it's a good way to think about it as things to look out for, because that would be in a very reactionary manner.
Hey, Gus, speak up a little bit. Sorry.
I don't think it would be a very good idea for us to talk about what we should look out for, and instead we should be planning proactively starting now. We need to be organizing. We need to be having meetings. We need to be discussing who or what we can get resources from to start. And again, I know that we can't do person to person, but we all are part of a bunch of networks of people that we can reach out to via phone, via Zoom, et cetera, to have political education discussions about this problem so that we're not waiting for that mailer to start acting. We're not waiting for drivers to say, we just been contacted about this proposition or this bill. You know, we have to be on the ground and we have to be moving in an offensive manner, you know, because again, we're not going to have the capital to fight the capital that the corporations have. So we have to have the people and the movement on the ground on our side so that, you know, we have to understand that if this happened in California, that's a very bad sign. That's, you know, we expect these things to happen in Alabama or Indiana. For it to happen in California is a telling sign as to the types of ways that they have models and they already have an idea of how to manipulate propaganda against us. So we have to be the ones to control the narrative, just like what Lisa and Andrew were talking about. Their experiences have to drive our organizing platform. That this is not something that is an individual case, but both of them share very similar experiences. And we know that other groups of drivers and temporary workers are going through this same thing. And so we have to be at the forefront now that where as soon as we log off of this, we should be emailing or contacting our networks or groups and saying, hey, we need to have a discussion about this because it's coming sooner than we think. So that's the first thing we have to do is we have to share the report that Professor Bruno and Professor and Frank put out there. And we need to have discussions and break that data down and do more studies and start getting people on the right side of the narrative. So we're the ones controlling the narrative when that bill does come, because it will come.
Also, too, a lot of the information that Terry had in there was just mind blowing. And we need to get to the drivers. But one of the things that Uber and Lyft, well, Uber did, when I started driving for Lyft, they would have me pick up somebody from Uber. A Uber person would take a Lyft to try to find out why I quit driving for Uber and would I be willing to come back. That happened more than once. So it was no coincidence that that's what they were doing. So I think I said that to say that I think that they would have these people in these cars to intimidate people in that, you know, this is coming up and this is what they're trying to tell you, you know what I mean? And people feeling like, well, they could just replace me. I mean, because basically anybody can drive. And so to get them to, you know, do whatever it is they wanted them to do. So that was my point.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two more questions together for the sake of time. So from Diamond, we got a question. They're sort of similar. From Diamond, we got a question about the rights of collective bargaining for these workers, and that they don't have, they're not under collective bargaining, but there is clearly organizing that's going on with these workers, and have they received any backlash? And then Scott Marshall, our good friend from SOAR, asked, he's the delegate to the Chicago Federation of Labor, and wonder what ideas folks have about how the labor movement can help organize support. And for example, how did California or other state labor movements, how have they worked on these issues? I will say, I know that in California, several unions with SEIU maybe at the forefront did spend money on the proposition. They spent about 20 million for, the 200 million that was on the other side. So it wasn't quite an equal fight. But so I'm going to open that up for everybody. I don't know, Bob, if you have a perspective on that, or Gus, I see you unmuted your mic. And if we could talk a little bit about, and she has no idea I'm about to say this, but one of our other LEP staff, Allison, is on the call, and she works with, she works very closely with non-unionized workers. So she might have something to add. Or if not tonight, we might bring her for a future forum. I don't want to put her too much on the spot.
I mean, the retaliation is very real, and I don't want to take the voices away from Lisa or Andrew. I'm sure they themselves or possibly know of people in terms of the retaliation of organizing that we've seen. And in the stories that I talked about earlier in Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Italy, for the types of resistance that they put forth against those companies so that the higher courts ruled in favor of the workers received a ton of backlash and in fact violence from private police forces against organizing. And those that are not familiar with labor struggles outside the US, particularly in those kinds of places, particularly in South America, the types of regimes and what they do to stop organizing is pretty brutal. And so we're not at that point here in the US yet. But in other cases there has been. If you paid attention to the COLA movement at the University of California, where they sent the police out to beat those graduate workers for going on strike. So again, we're not that far away from what's happening in Brazil and Italy in terms of retaliation, but that's something that's always to be expected in relation to this situation. And as for the biggest thing that we have to ask for the labor movement to do is resources and funding. The purpose of the due structure is to support local organizing. So therefore, money has to be distributed and allocated for those organizing purposes to protect workers and to build a stronger labor movement. So the biggest thing that organized labor can do to support non-union workers who are at a threat from the gig economy is to put up the money that is there for organizing and fund local organizers, hire community stewards out of the neighborhoods, because a lot of people do need jobs now who could be full-time organizers, and build those local sectors up through a campaign model. That's available and has been successful in the past, but we have to pressure the union leadership at the international level to put forth those funds. And that is the main thing that is going to be the make or break for us winning this type of situation. Are resources for organizing, really in the idea of funding.
I don't really have much to add to that. Bob, I'm going to give you, I think we told our speakers that we weren't going to let this go too long. I know it's even later on the East Coast. And Terry, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to share one last thought, which is, even though this happened in California, it really was, they have this weird ballot initiative system. They were able to mislead all of these people. And they are trying now. They feel really buoyed by their success, and they feel like they have momentum, and they're going to all these other states. But there are a lot of other states. Yes, California is traditionally so progressive and everything, but there are a lot of other states that have a really strong pro-labor tradition. Obviously, Illinois, New York, Massachusetts. And I really don't think that we should sort of assume that this, we should assume that this is something that can be won, and that this is not a done deal, just because this happened in California. I really do think there's a number of other states where these gig companies already got carve outs through the legislature, states that are not so worker friendly. But I do think that, I don't want people to feel like just because this happened in California, it is, the California legislature passed AB 5, the Supreme Court there passed AB 5. It's just this weird ballot initiative thing that they flooded. I mean, $220 million is almost $250 million. So if you go to the legislature, they're operating with different kinds of structures in different states. And so I really think it's worth, I think people should feel serious and energized, but California is one place and Illinois is another.
And I agree. And I think just recently, both in Chicago and Illinois, we have seen some very serious victories by labor. I mean, we also saw, we had that tax initiative, and that was not so positive, but we have seen some very, very serious victories from labor over the last few years. So I do agree that we have potential. I like this last word. So Frank, I'm going to give you, what is your last word? Then I'll go to Lisa, then Andrew, and then I'm going to give it to Bob to end us. So Frank, do you have a last word?
You know what? It's not really last word. It's just to look out for some other upcoming research that will probably help in this fight. Our colleagues at UIC are doing some excellent research in this area. And then we also know of a professor from the University of Chicago who's also, he's done work that I cited actually in our study for the driver pay standard in New York City, and doing some great work, or looking to do some work for Uber and Lyft drivers here in Chicago. So just a plug to keep looking out for the great research, and look out for the Illinois Economic Policy Institute and even more of the things that we're going to come out with over the course of the year. So that's all I have. Thanks.
Awesome. And I did put the PMCR website in the comments earlier. I think next we'll hear from Lisa. A last word?
So from being involved when Chicago was threatening to get rid of rideshare, what they're going to do is they're going to send out a mass email to all their workers to scare them into thinking that this is bad for them. So we would have to get in front of that. You know what I mean? That this is what they're going to say, like letting them know this is what they're going to say, but this is the reality of it. These are the numbers, and numbers don't lie. So that's pretty much all I got.
No, I think that's really important. And you're right. That is what's going to happen, and it is what we need to do. Andrew, a last word.
I don't have much to add. Thanks for letting us speak as people out here on the front line. We make up a major portion of that, of the gig economy and Uber and Lyft. And just be safe out there, fellow drivers. And thank you all, like I said, for having us. And we're out here with you to join the fight for labor. We need to restore a lot of the labor rights that have been destroyed. So that's it for me.
Thank you. Definitely. And Bob, we'll end it with you.
Thanks, Steph. Let me add my thanks to Terry and Frank for showing us some really insightful findings based on research that was done and practices. It's always a special pleasure of mine to work with Brother Frank. It's a great organization that he heads, and it's a wonderful partnership between PMCR and LEPI. Also, Andrew and Lisa, it means a great deal to have your authentic voices speaking to these real practices. And hopefully you'll take away from this that there is a network, there is a community, there are people who are attentive to the problems you're facing and want to be part of that struggle. And we'll use our gifts and talents to aid the work that needs to be done. And obviously to Gus and Stephanie for hosting this, offering some really trenchant comments, and Allison for helping with the logistics and administering all of this. And as a plug, before we sign off, in February, Stephanie mentioned it earlier, on February the 18th, again from 6 to 7:30 or so, we will do a third program focusing on gig work, and we'll be talking about a broader erosion of labor protections. You may be familiar with the terminology, the fishering of the modern workplace. And so David Wheel is a friend of the program. You may remember David headed up the Wage and Hour Division under the Obama administration. He's now a dean and professor at the Heller School of Business and Social Policy at Brandeis. David is going to join us, and I'm also really excited that one of our other LEP PMCR colleagues, Allison Dixon, who's also on the call, who is a outstanding researcher in her own right and has contributed a lot of outstanding reports to PMCR, and one really big one coming out on childcare. And one on scheduling, precarious scheduling, which was just released. Allison will also join us. So we'll be putting this thing together, and that'll be on February the 18th, and hopefully all of you will join us. So tell your friends, to join us and support the cause. And with that, I'll wish all of you a safe and good night.
Thank you very much.
You guys are awesome. That was amazing.